Thank you so much, Dan. My name is Raquel Fleskis. I'm a graduate student here at Penn studying molecular anthropology. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about genetics as kind of a warm-up for our panel presentation tonight. So jumping right on into it, I have put 3 words on the screen. These words that you may or may not have seen before, probably have, but you may or may not know the difference between. Yet the difference between these words is quite substantial. They're used to categorize oneself and others, and they're also used differently within the realm of genetics. So first, I have defined race. So race I have defined as a social category or perception used to define people based on skin color. And I'd like to draw attention to 2 things within this definition. One, that it's a social categorization, meaning that it may carry with it stigmatizations and stereotypes. And 2, that it's based on skin color, which is used as a perceived superficial trait to reflect more innate biological differences that actually do not exist. Second, I would like to talk about ancestry. So ancestry is a person's familial background or genealogy. This is perceived as a more accurate way of understanding human population origins because it does not use social categorization, but rather geographical affinity. And lastly, we have the term ethnicity. Ethnicity I have defined as a grouping of people with shared cultural, religious, linguistic, or national identities. This is seen as a better way to talk about social categories because it doesn't actually use biological characteristics, but rather uses self-identified cultural notions of community. So now that we've talked about these 3 words, we're going to layer on some genetic terminology to see how these words interact within the larger realm of genetics. So in DNA, it's pretty hard to get around the word, so in genetics, it's pretty hard to get around the word DNA. DNA carries with it the instructions for maintaining and creating all forms of life in biological entities. It's passed down from parent to child, meaning that it's inherited. What many people may not know is that we actually have 2 forms of DNA in our bodies. We have our nuclear DNA, and we also have mitochondrial DNA. Your nuclear DNA is your chromosomal DNA, which reflects your entire genome. This in contrast with your mitochondrial DNA, which is much smaller, which is found in the mitochondria, which is a cellular organelle also known as the powerhouse of the cell. So oftentimes in genetics, you hear the words genotype and phenotype. Genotype is the set of genes that an organism carries, whereas the phenotype is the physical expression of that genotype. So like in this picture up here, we have our chromosomes with our blue and our brown genes per se, which hypothetically code for this brown coat color in this mouse. Now in reality, it's much more complicated than that. There's environmental influences that shape the amount of gene expression. There's different amounts of genes and different numbers of genes that can affect the gene expression as well. And we really want to move away from this kind of simplistic one-to-one interpretation of genotype to phenotype. And this is really important in discussions on genetic essentialism, which is the tendency to infer certain behaviors and characteristics as being determined by one's genes. So you guys may have heard the phrase, you must have a gene for that. Now this kind of colloquial phrase can tend to lead to a more simplistic, reduced version of who we are as human beings. Our identities, behaviors, and really even our genetics are impacted by complex environmental and cultural factors that shape who we are as human beings. So we tend to try to move away from genetic essentialist terminology and language, which also can sometimes be used when talking about mutation. So I've defined mutation as a small genetic difference between people and populations. Now this is a little bit simpler than what mutations can be discussed about in genetic literature. It can range from things that are very small, that don't have any effect at all, or things that are large, such in cancer studies. Certain mutations can have huge impacts for human health and disease. But understanding that a lot of these terms and a lot of concepts in genetics, they tend to be talked about in a really simple way, but tend to also have much more complex, can kind of help problematize race and genetics. One such mutation that's really important in the study of genetics and race, or a couple of them, so to speak, have to do with skin color. So I have on the screen a picture of a map with the distribution of skin color throughout the world, going from darkest around the poles, around the equator, gradiating out until the lightest around the poles. So this is termed clinal variation. A lot of researchers, such as Nina Jablonski and others, have talked about skin color pigmentation as being an adaptation to UV radiation. So thus, people living around the equator and also at high altitudes have higher exposure to UV. Thus, they have had an adaptation to have more melanin and melanocytes in their skin to protect against that UV. So when you go closer to the poles, the amount of UV radiation that you actually get exposed to is much less. Thus, the amount of melanin in your skin is not required, or is required to a lesser degree. So this is caused by mutations in multiple genes. This is also called a polygenic trait. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and now we're going to talk about genetic ancestry testing. I'm sure you guys have heard of genetic ancestry testing before. It tests your DNA for patterns of genetic variation indicative of certain ancestries. Companies like 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, African Ancestry, Ancestry DNA, all will test your DNA. They'll do different kinds of tests, but they also have different kinds of reference databases. So if you submit your DNA to more than one of these companies, there is a chance you may get something slightly different. And this is something I'm sure will come up in our panel discussions further on. So, and the different types of tests that these companies use are based off of what we call patterns of inheritance. So like I said when I was talking about DNA, we have two different kinds of DNA, or two different forms of DNA in our body. We have our nuclear DNA, which is inherited from all of our ancestors. So for instance, man over there, gets his DNA from his mom and his dad, and then his parents get them from his parents, and so on and so forth. So when we're doing nuclear DNA tests, it's actually the accumulation of all of our DNA from all of our ancestors. One specific form of nuclear DNA is your Y chromosome DNA. Now, not everyone here has a Y chromosome. If you're a genetic female, you don't have a Y chromosome. But if you are a genetic male, then you can get your Y chromosome tested, which will reveal paternal inheritance. And so he gets it from his father, who gets it from his father, who gets it from his father. So it's revealing only one line of your genetic lineage in comparison to your nuclear DNA. So your mitochondrial DNA also does something very similar. You inherit it directly from your mother, and her mother inherits it from her mother. So again, it only reveals the maternal inheritance of your ancestry, only one line as indicated in this diagram. So all three of these different forms of inheritance can tell you something slightly different about your ancestry and your past. And it's always good to get all three of them if you can. It'll tell you something slightly different. And oftentimes when we're talking about nuclear DNA, you're going to hear terms admixture and gene flow. Admixture refers to the exchange of genetic material between different populations. So as for instance on the screen, I found a blog post of a man who got his ancestry DNA tested. And he said that he had 48% Nigerian ancestry, 20% from the Ivory Coast, and so on. So what this is referring to is that in certain points of time, different populations came through, or different individuals from these populations came through and admixed, so they had some sort of gene flow, creating him who he is today, however many generations back. And so I want to end my talk by talking about genetic diversity. So we're talking about the small differences between human beings, but it's really important to remember that humans are 99.5% genetically similar. And the differences that we do have between groups are far from that of being genetic subspecies. Really, it's just very small differences that are a result of human migration patterns through time. Starting from Africa, from anatomically modern humans migrating out into Europe, Asia, Indonesia, and into the Americas. So my hope is that we can use genetics to figure out our common past, and thus also celebrate the differences between us as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Janet, and she can give us a talk on the Morton collection. Thank you.